Hey friends, welcome to week 8 of Explore God's Story. I hope that you have enjoyed your time as you've been reading along in the scriptures and engaging in meaningful discussion with others, wrestling together with how you are experiencing God, experiencing God's story, and how the Holy Spirit is writing you into this story. Today we pick up in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, continuing on in Jesus' words, his teaching here, this kind of restatement of both the Ten Commandments and the law code given in Deuteronomy, emphasizing sincere and humble devotion. Jesus teaches about prayer, about advocating for a private, heartfelt approach, contrasting with the hypocritical practices of the Pharisees and any other person that might lean more towards a legalistic way of doing things as opposed to a genuine, heartfelt engagement with these spiritual practices. The Lord's Prayer is a central element providing a model for prayer, and he discusses fasting and storing treasures in heaven rather than on earth, trusting God for our needs instead of worrying. The sermon concludes with teachings on judgment, God's willingness to give good gifts to God's children, and the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. All of these are important for building one's life on the teachings of Jesus. And Jesus likens this to this wise person who builds their house on the rock, that when the winds and rains come, that the house is able to stand, versus building it on sand where winds and rain come and washes the house away. Centered right in the heart of the Gospel of Matthew here is Matthew chapter 13, which features a series of parables which arguably can be seen as kind of the heart of Jesus' teaching about God's kingdom. What is God's kingdom like? How do we know when we are in the kingdom? How do we know that the kingdom is around us? And here we have the parables of the sower, of the weeds, of the mustard seed, of the yeast and the hidden treasure and the pearl and the net, all of these illustrating different aspects of God's kingdom, of the kingdom of heaven, and our response to the kingdom. We go over to Matthew chapter 15, where Jesus confronts the Pharisees on their legalism, emphasizing this inner purity over ritual cleanness. And it includes the faith of the Canaanite woman, showing that God's grace is extended beyond Israel. And it includes then the feeding of the 4,000, illustrating the universality of Jesus' compassion and divine provision. We skip over to Luke chapter 9, which stands as this critical pivot point in Luke's gospel, as Jesus turns from his ministry that's based solely in Galilee to now setting his face towards Jerusalem and his ministry towards his impending exodus and his impending death. It recounts Jesus sending out the 12 with power and authority, of Herod's curiosity about Jesus, the feeding of the 5,000, Peter's confession of Christ, the transfiguration, and that all these events underscoring Jesus' own divine authority, the nature of this kingdom that Jesus is proclaiming, and the call of discipleship. We skip ahead to Luke chapter 10, which includes that famous parable of the Good Samaritan, this key teaching on what it means to truly love one's neighbor as oneself, with the critical question, who is my neighbor? We learn about the expansive nature of mercy and how it cuts across cultural and religious barriers. We go backwards to Matthew chapter 14, where we follow, which follows then the feeding of the 5,000, where we hear about the story of Jesus walking on water and the healing of the sick in Gennesaret. This miracle on the sea demonstrates Jesus' mastery over nature and serves as this revelation of divine identity to the disciples. When the disciples ask about who this person is, Jesus says, "Don't be afraid, I am." In other words, don't be afraid, I am God. And we find even Peter then is emboldened by God's self-revelation through Jesus to walk on water with Jesus here. We get the healing miracles in Gennesaret, further establishing Jesus' compassion and power to heal, reinforcing his messianic identity for all. We look ahead to John chapter 9. Here's another critical piece in the Gospel of John, which details the healing of a man born blind and becomes this discourse on spiritual blindness and sight, emphasizing these important themes throughout John's Gospel. This miracle provokes controversy among the Pharisees, which highlights their own spiritual blindness. And then we get to John chapter 11, this critical point where Jesus' friend Lazarus dies, and we see the depth of Jesus' own care for his dear friend. But then we also see this foreshadowing of Jesus' own resurrection when Jesus comes and raises Lazarus from the dead. And he calls out to him, "Lazarus, come forth." And in this dramatic scene, Lazarus comes out of his tomb, but he's still bound in his burial cloths. And Jesus instructs those around him to unbind him and to let him go. A call for each and every one of us. This event sets the stage for this final sequence of events leading to Jesus' own crucifixion. We also take a look in the Gospel of Mark to Mark chapter 5, where we find Jesus bringing healing to this man who is bound and oppressed by these demons in the Gerasene tombs. And Jesus' encounter with this man who's possessed by this legion of demons demonstrates his power over every evil force. And the transformation of the demoniac from a state of extreme torment to sanity and peace causes havoc in his neighborhood. The people around him don't know what to do with him now that he's no longer acting crazy, but he's in his own right mind. And it leads to a question of what does it mean for us when we see Jesus coming into our neighborhood, liberating those that we had long dismissed as being too crazy to ever be healed or to ever know freedom. It underscores the full liberating power of Jesus and how we are invited to participate in that liberation, even when it feels utterly upsetting to our own sensibilities. The healed man's commission to tell others throughout the Decapolis, this place of godlessness really, about everything that Jesus did for him, highlights the spread of Jesus' message beyond Jewish territories and thus the universality of Jesus' own mission. Lastly, we get to Luke chapter 22, which begins to tell the passion narrative, including the plot to kill Jesus, the Last Supper that Jesus has with his friends around the table, Jesus' prediction of Peter's denial, and his agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. The Last Supper establishes the practice of communion for us, which symbolizes Jesus' own sacrifice for us. We see Jesus' agony in Gethsemane, which reveals his human vulnerability and his submission to the will of God, foreshadowing his impending suffering and crucifixion. It sets the tone for the culmination of Jesus' earthly ministry and the fulfillment of his redemption of all the world. So friends, happy exploring, and may the Holy Spirit give you eyes and ears to see and hear how God is summoning you to participate in this story today.